Essa é a história de um dia que, na minha memória, foi assustador. O meu primeiro dia de trabalho como assessor de investimentos. Então foi em 2010, no escritório de uma corretora que hoje nem existe mais. A primeira coisa que eu descobri quando eu cheguei no escritório para trabalhar foi que não tinha nenhuma mesa nem cadeira para mim. A segunda coisa que eu descobri foi que eu não tinha chefe e nem equipe para me ajudar. E se eu ficasse parado em algum canto durante 9 horas, até o horário de ir embora, absolutamente ninguém iria ali falar comigo. Eu tinha sido contratado dias antes e eu não fazia ideia de como seria o trabalho. Assim que eu encontrei uma cadeira vazia, eu passei a pensar que, eu vou sentar aqui, e será que alguém pode me ajudar? E naquele tempo, o negócio de assessoria de investimentos era bem diferente do que é hoje. Hoje é algo extremamente profissional. Só que em 2010 era um amadorismo completo, era meio que cada um por si. E como eu nunca tinha trabalhado como assessor de investimentos, nem tinha estudado finanças na faculdade, obviamente eu não estava pronto para a função. Eu nem sabia por onde eu começaria. E eu resolvi pedir ajuda ao assessor de investimentos que estava do meu lado. Ele topou me passar algumas dicas. O problema é que ele me ensinou tudo errado. Nessa época, nem eu, nem ele tínhamos ideia do que era ajudar pessoas a investir melhor. Esse cara, ele ganhava um bom dinheiro, porque ele já tinha clientes grandes que giravam bem a carteira dele naquela época. E ainda não era claro para nós que investimentos e trading não eram a mesma coisa. Ele ficava ali, incentivando os clientes dele a comprar e a vender ações rapidamente, ganhando um monte de comissão. E na falta de outra referência, foi assim que eu comecei a trabalhar com assessoria de investimentos. Então eu ficava o dia inteiro tentando trazer mais clientes, mas eu quase nunca tinha sucesso. Então quando eu conseguia algum cliente, esse assessor que sentava do meu lado começava a incentivar esse cliente a girar a carteira. E hoje eu vejo que ainda bem que pouca gente veio investir comigo nessa época. Porque quanto mais gente viesse fazer trading conosco, mais gente perderia dinheiro na bolsa. E ingenuinamente, eu achava que o cliente ganharia dinheiro fazendo trading, long and short, estripulias, maluquices, Eu nem sabia que o jeito que eu mais poderia contribuir com os clientes seria montando uma carteira de investimentos diversificada com objetivo de longo prazo. Eu era tão imaturo que eu nem tinha entendido que o meu papel ali era ajudar o cliente a ganhar dinheiro. O mercado era tão diferente de hoje que as próprias corretoras não estavam preparadas para ajudar o cliente a ganhar dinheiro. Você abria conta numa corretora e você recebia a senha para operar as suas ações e derivativos no home broker, e era isso. Então não tinha fundos de investimento, não tinha renda fixa, não tinha previdência. O mercado de ações ele era encarado pelos pequenos investidores quase como um cassino. E até tinha alguns fundos imobiliários, mas o desconhecimento era muito grande e pouquíssima gente investia. ETF, por exemplo, só tinha do Ibovespa. Os BDRs quase não tinham negócios e só os investidores multimilionários já tinham despertado para as oportunidades que eram oferecidas pelas ações de empresas estrangeiras. As pessoas usavam a bolsa muito mais para fazer apostas sobre a direção do preço no curto prazo do que como uma forma de construir patrimônio no longo prazo. O trading ele até deu certo nos anos 2000, quando o Brasil viveu o boom da China e das commodities. Só que a crise de 2008 ela escancarou os riscos para o investidor que só tinha ações na carteira. A XP foi a primeira corretora que entendeu o recado. Se a XP não desse aos clientes opções de investimentos que permitissem a eles ganhar dinheiro em qualquer cenário, a empresa não continuaria crescendo quando o bull market acabasse. E a solução encontrada pela XP na época foi copiar o modelo da americana Charles Schwab, uma das maiores empresas de investimentos do mundo, hoje com 8 trilhões de dólares em ativos. E até então, nenhuma corretora tinha tido a ideia de criar uma plataforma completa com fundos de investimento, tesouro direto, títulos de renda fixa emitidos por bancos e empresas, ativos em dólar, previdência, investimentos imobiliários, produtos estruturados e um monte de outras coisas. E você pode não acreditar, mas até 2010, nenhuma plataforma de investimentos permitia que o assessor fizesse seu trabalho direito, ajudando seu cliente a montar uma carteira diversificada. E com a criação do shopping financeiro da XP, muitos assessores começaram a migrar para lá porque entenderam que finalmente seria possível montar carteiras mais preparadas para as crises. E finalmente, os assessores poderiam auxiliar os clientes na montagem de carteiras diversificadas de investimentos, seguindo as regras de uma ciência chamada Asset Allocation. Olá, eu sou o Thiago Negro e essa é a segunda aula dessa série sobre a maior porta de entrada para você trabalhar no mercado financeiro. Hoje, meu convidado especial vai mostrar como um especialista em investimentos pode ajudar os seus clientes a obter os maiores retornos, obviamente correndo o menor risco possível. O tema da aula de hoje é Asset Allocation. E talvez você nunca tenha ouvido falar, mas o Asset Allocation é tão importante que mais de 10 professores de finanças americanos já ganharam um prêmio Nobel de Economia por suas contribuições ao assunto. Mas por que o Asset Allocation é tão importante? Eu te digo, é porque ele é libertador. Se você se tornar um especialista em Asset Allocation, você nunca mais vai precisar adivinhar o futuro para ganhar dinheiro no mercado. Porque no stock picking, na análise fundamentalista, você precisa adivinhar o futuro para comprar as ações que vão se valorizar acima da média. No market timing, na análise técnica, você também precisa adivinhar o futuro para antecipar algum movimento de curto prazo e bater o mercado. Você precisa acertar o que vai acontecer nas próximas horas, dias ou semanas. E eu não estou dizendo que você não vai se dar bem, só estou dizendo que é mais difícil. Tanto que grandes especialistas mundiais em finanças, como o David Swensen, o Charles Ellis e muitos outros, eles costumam dizer que market timing e stock picking são jogos de perdedores. E estatisticamente a sua derrota é mais provável que a sua vitória. Agora, tem outro jogo que é onde eu acho que o assessor de investimentos mais cria valor de forma escalável. Tá? Esse jogo é o Asset Allocation. E por que ele funciona melhor? Justamente porque no Asset Allocation você ganha dinheiro mesmo sem adivinhar o futuro. A premissa básica na construção de portfólios modernos é que a gente não sabe o que vai acontecer. O que a gente conhece é o perfil, a tolerância a risco e as necessidades de cada investidor. E o Asset Allocation, ele prega a montagem de carteiras muito mais com base em perfil, risco e necessidades do que numa suposta capacidade de adivinhar o futuro. E a partir do momento em que a gente admite que ninguém consegue antever o comportamento futuro dos preços no curto prazo, a gente tenta construir uma carteira que vai performar satisfatoriamente, independente do que vem acontecer no futuro. Você escolhe os melhores ativos de cada classe e você mistura ativos com comportamentos descorrelacionados. Então você evita pagar demais por cada ativo e você espera. Nada além disso. Olha esse exemplo. O Ray Dalio é dono de uma gestora de fundos que administra cerca de 150 bilhões de dólares em ativos, a Bridgewater. E o maior fundo do Ray Dalio é também o maior hedge fund do mundo, que é o Bridgewater All Weather. E numa tradução livre do inglês, All Weather seria algo como qualquer condição meteorológica. Do que o Ray Dalio estava pensando quando ele batizou o maior hedge fund do mundo de All Weather? Bom, a promessa, que está implícita no nome desse fundo, é que seria uma boa carteira, com boa performance ao longo dos anos. Faça chuva ou faça sol no mercado financeiro. E por que esse fundo se tornou o maior hedge fund do mundo? É porque ele entrega exatamente o que a maioria dos investidores deseja. Um portfólio com ganhos consistentes ao longo dos anos, independente do que aconteça no mercado financeiro. E é exatamente isso que o investidor quer. É exatamente isso que o bom Asset Allocation entrega. E é exatamente nisso que o bom assessor de investimentos se especializa. Esse é o jogo dos vencedores. Esse é o jogo dos mais bem-sucedidos investidores do mundo. E esse é o jogo que eu mesmo jogo, que incentivo você a jogar e que quero ver seus clientes ou futuros clientes jogando. Então vamos ver um exemplo prático do Asset Allocation. Eu tenho a minha carteira de investimentos pública. Tá? Há quase 4 anos eu conto para vocês, uma vez ao mês, o que eu estou fazendo com o meu dinheiro no quadro Rumo ao Bilhão no meu canal do YouTube. Em todos os anos, desde que minha carteira virou pública em 2018, houve uma valorização do portfólio. E melhor, no meu pior ano, eu ganhei 21%. Quando eu comecei em 2018, a minha carteira pública subiu 33%. Em 2019, a alta foi de 100%, algo impressionante. Em 2020, houve uma alta de 25%. E no ano passado, o mais difícil, desde que eu comecei a montar minha carteira pública, eu tive uma valorização de 21%. Nesse período, a gente teve anos muito bons para a bolsa e para mim, como 2018 e 2019. Já 2020 não foi tão bom. A bolsa desabou com o Covid, ela se recuperou e fechou o ano quase que no 0 a 0. E 2021 foi bem difícil. Muitas ações ligadas ao mercado interno levaram uma surra. E o Ibovespa caiu 12%. E só não foi pior devido ao bom desempenho das commodities. Ou seja, dos 4 anos analisados, o Ibovespa foi muito bem em 2, ficou parado em 1 e foi mal em 1. Mas como que a minha carteira se comportou? Mesmo nos piores anos, ela se valorizou mais de 20%. E lógico que em alguns meses minha carteira ela também sofreu, e sofreu muito. E eu não estou dizendo que eu descobri uma fórmula mágica que faz minha carteira subir em linha reta. Em 2022, por exemplo, eu estou sofrendo um pouco. Mas sabe o que eu faço para conseguir ganhos em períodos mais longos, mesmo quando as carteiras da maioria das pessoas caem? Eu faço bem o Asset Allocation. Então, primeiro eu escolho ótimos ativos em cada classe. Então eu escolho ações brasileiras e americanas, fundos imobiliários e ativos de renda fixa e criptomoedas. Depois eu misturo esses ativos de diversas classes com comportamentos descorrelacionados na mesma carteira, de forma que se um vai mal, provavelmente outro vai bem. E no final, quando a bolsa tem um ano muito difícil em que muita coisa cai, alguns ativos se valorizam e compensam ou ao menos amortecem o impacto. Um jeito fácil de ilustrar isso é comprar ações brasileiras e dólar ao mesmo tempo. Se as ações brasileiras caem muito, o dólar sobe. Se o dólar ele cai muito, as ações brasileiras sobem. Um movimento amortece o outro e com isso a minha carteira ela chacoalha menos. No ano passado eu tive perdas com algumas ações brasileiras e fundos imobiliários. Mas algumas ações brasileiras e os meus BDRs subiram. Meros e Inter foram duas ações que foram muito bem. E no final, eu consegui obter uma valorização de mais de 21% mesmo no ano ruim. Sabe o que é isso? É o Asset Allocation funcionando direitinho. Você lembra que na aula passada eu falei do meu método TOP? Era T de técnica, O de orientação a resultados e P de posicionamento digital. O Asset Allocation é a técnica, é o T. É a técnica de investir que vai separar o bom assessor de investimentos do mau assessor. É a técnica que vai separar o assessor que vai conquistar os seus primeiros 10 clientes e vai deixar esses caras tão satisfeitos que cada um vai te indicar outros 10 clientes. E a bola de neve vai girar. E quando você vê, você já vai ter 50 milhões ou 100 milhões de reais em custódia dos seus clientes e já vai ter conquistado uma remuneração muito superior à da maioria dos brasileiros. E para chegar lá, a primeira coisa que você tem que aprender é montar um portfólio all-weather. E já eu vou te falar quem eu trouxe aqui para dar essa aula de Asset Allocation para você. Mas antes de apresentar o meu convidado, eu quero te dar alguns breves avisos. Primeiro, cadastre-se aqui no nosso grupo de WhatsApp para você receber o resumo dessa e das próximas aulas. A cada aula desse curso, a gente também vai dar uma bolsa integral de estudos para o MBA em Investimentos e Asset Allocation que eu vou lançar na próxima semana. E para tentar ganhar uma bolsa hoje, você só precisa estar no nosso grupo de WhatsApp e deixar o seu comentário logo aqui abaixo do vídeo com a hashtag Asset Allocation. Nesse comentário, você tem que me explicar por que você acredita que o Asset Allocation pode ajudar os investidores a obter ganhos de longo prazo, independente do que acontecer no futuro. Por exemplo, hashtag Asset Allocation. Adivinhar o futuro é coisa da mãe de Ná. Sei lá. Tem formas mais interessantes de perder a reputação do que fazendo previsões sobre o futuro da economia ou do mercado financeiro. Eu prefiro o Asset Allocation, que me gera ótimos resultados, faça chuva ou faça sol. Então é muito simples deixar a frase que começa aqui embaixo, beleza? E se você quer ganhar uma bolsa integral para cursar esse MBA, já pausa esse vídeo aqui e comenta. Mas calma, que não é só isso não. Para ganhar a bolsa de estudos integral, você ainda precisa fazer a prova que também está disponível aqui embaixo. Então, entre as pessoas que tiverem feito a prova, a gente vai escolher a que criou o comentário mais criativo com a hashtag Asset Allocation e premiar essa pessoa com uma bolsa de estudos. A prova é tranquila, eu tenho certeza que muitos de vocês vão tirar nota 10. Tudo que está sendo perguntado ou foi ensinado na aula passada ou vai ser ensinado na aula de hoje. Então presta muita atenção nessas duas aulas. Quem fizer a prova ganha ainda um certificado de participação nessa aula magna. E tem mais, todos que tirarem nota 6 ou mais nessa prova vão ter um direito a um desconto de 20% ao se matricularem no MBA Investimentos e Asset Allocation, que a gente vai lançar na próxima semana. Vai anotando o que está sendo ensinado, que você vai tirar muito mais que 6 nessa prova. Então, garante seu desconto, certificado e também a possibilidade de obter uma bolsa integral. Já deixe seu comentário aqui, agora mesmo, tá? Encerrados os avisos, vamos agora com o nosso convidado especial, o Moshe Milevsky. Ele é PhD em Finanças e professor na York University, em Toronto. O professor Mosh passou a maior parte da vida estudando Asset Allocation com um viés de investimentos para o longo prazo. E o principal tema dos seus estudos é a construção de carteiras de investimentos para aposentadoria. Nessa aula, você vai ver que o professor Mosh não vai ficar falando se o Fed vai ou não subir os juros, se o Lula ou o Bolsonaro vai ganhar a eleição, se vai ter uma guerra devastadora. E é lógico que tudo isso impacta, né, nos seus investimentos e nos meus investimentos de curto prazo, mas quando você tem uma visão de longuíssimo prazo, de deixar o seu dinheiro investido durante vários anos, essas coisas pouco importam. E pode parecer estranho isso para você, mas o mercado é assim mesmo. 99% das pessoas prestam atenção ao que não importa e só 1% presta atenção ao que importa. O pessoal olha muito para as notícias do dia e eles se atentam muito pouco às grandes tendências seculares. E na verdade, o dia importa pouco, porque os grandes problemas do mundo eles vão sendo superados. A Segunda Guerra Mundial fez o mercado desabar, mas uma hora a Segunda Guerra acaba. As crises do petróleo fizeram a bolsa despencar na década de 70, mas nos anos 80 os mercados se recuperaram. Nos anos 2000 houve o estouro da bolha das empresas.com e o atentado de 11 de setembro. Com a Covid, todo mundo aqui se lembra que a bolsa caiu muito e depois subiu muito. Porque no curto prazo, as pessoas se desesperam, mas no longo prazo, as coisas se resolvem. Então, a partir de agora, eu vou convidar você a deixar de lado esse mindset de curto prazo e aprender a montar carteiras de investimento que performam bem, faça chuva ou faça sol. Isso não tem nada a ver com o noticiário do dia. Tem a ver com misturar ativos de uma forma a obter sempre o maior retorno com o menor risco. E tem a ver com as características pessoais de cada investidor. Como o seu perfil de investidor, seu emprego e sua idade não mudam toda hora, você também não deveria mexer na sua carteira de investimentos toda hora. Concorda? A tese do professor Mosh, que eu mais gosto, diz que a principal informação que você tem que levar em consideração na hora de montar uma carteira de investimentos não é a idade, nem o tempo até a aposentadoria, e nem a renda, e nem o perfil de risco de cada investidor. Na verdade, o mais importante é entender com o que o investidor trabalha e a natureza de sua renda. No livro Are You a Stock or a Bond? Ou Você é uma ação ou um título de renda fixa, em português, o professor Mosh diz que se você tem uma renda alta e previsível, você deveria investir mais em ações, independente da idade, perfil de risco ou tempo até a aposentadoria. Já se você é empresário e você não tem salário fixo, você tem fluxos de caixa imprevisíveis e você já vive numa montanha-russa financeira na sua empresa, você deveria investir majoritariamente em renda fixa. Mas não tem motivo para eu ficar detalhando muito isso para vocês agora. Eu vou deixar o próprio professor explicar sua tese nessa aula incrível de Asset Allocation. Com vocês agora, o Mosh Milevski fala sobre Asset Allocation nessa conversa com meu amigo e sócio, Breno Perrucho. Boa aula! Bem-vindos para essa sessão de perguntas e respostas que a gente está prestes a fazer com o professor Mosh Milevski. Meu nome é Breno Perrucho, eu sou criador do canal Jovens de Negócios e eu espero que seja tão engrandecedor para você quanto certamente vai ser para mim a gente cutucar na cabeça dessa pessoa incrível e extrair o máximo de conhecimento possível nessa sessão que a gente tem. Professor Mosh, first of all, I would like to thank you for agreeing to having this conversation with us. It is personally an honor to be speaking to you today.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
So there's this saying that says that wise is not the man who knows all the right answers, but the one who can ask the right questions. So I'll try to do my best here to pick your brain a little and hopefully have all the right questions for you in order for us to take the most out of all the things that I'm sure you're going to teach us today.
So my name is Moshe Milevski. I teach at York University, that's in Toronto, Canada. So my day job is teaching undergraduate and graduate students in the business school, finance, economics, insurance, as well as wealth management. In addition to that, I'm also a fintech entrepreneur. I've started a number of companies, and I sold one about 6 years ago to a large financial company in Canada called Canex. So I spend about half of my time in academia, teaching, and the other half of my time in industry. 1 foot in the real world, 1 foot in the ivory tower.
So investors usually take into account information such as age, time to retirement, knowledge of the financial market, risk tolerance, and such to build their portfolios. But in your book, Are You a Stock or a Bond? You argue that the type of occupation and the type of employer are actually the most important factors in building a portfolio. And
I would like to hear your thoughts about it.
So obviously the factors that you mentioned are very important for building a portfolio. I'm not dismissing them, but the main argument that I try to make in the book, Are You a Stock or a Bond?, is that for most people, especially when they're young, the most valuable asset that they have isn't their portfolio or even their house. The most valuable asset is them, their job, what they do for a living. It can be worth millions and millions, and my argument is that the characteristics of what you do for a living should have a greater impact on your financial portfolio than some of the other factors that you mentioned. So for example, if you are a banker and you work in the financial industry, your job or your human capital very much depends on how financial markets perform. If financial markets are doing well, you will do well. If financial markets go down, you won't do as well. So your portfolio, much smaller, should be invested in other things. If you're in the real estate business, you work as a real estate agent. When the real estate market is doing well, you're doing well. If real estate prices are falling, you're not going to do as well. You won't sell as many houses. Your financial portfolio shouldn't be in real estate. That's the idea. Are you more of a stock, risky, or more of a bond? That has a more important impact on how to build your portfolio than some of the other things that you mentioned.
That's very interesting, because what you're saying is that basically someone who is, for example, an entrepreneur, it would probably have a portfolio that's different to someone who's hired by some other person, right?
Absolutely. So we can both be 40 years old and we can both have the same amount of money in our portfolio. But if you're an entrepreneur and I happen to be a mechanical engineer, I'm an engineer, you're an entrepreneur, even though we are the same age and have the same amount of money and even the same risk tolerance, but my job has very different characteristics than your job, we should have very different portfolios.
Sure. The exposure to the market is different because, and while someone who has this job, it is fixed. It's a fixed income that person is going to have, while an entrepreneur is also susceptible to the variation of the market. Do you believe that diversification is the only free lunch in the financial market?
So free lunch is a word that was invented in the 1950s and 60s. It may not be the right way to describe diversification. Free sounds like something you don't have to pay for. And if you diversify, you will pay because the upside from taking a concentrated bet is going to be reduced. So I don't think I would describe diversification as a free lunch. I would describe diversification as healthy financial practice, hygiene. You have hygiene on the personal health level, you have it on the personal wealth level. And to be very honest, there's a paradox at the heart of diversification. I always tell my students, all the billionaires that you know, name 3 billionaires, billions, none of them diversified. They didn't become very, very wealthy from diversifying. They took very concentrated bets. So on the one hand, we're telling our students, diversify, it's important. On the other hand, we know that if you want to get really, really wealthy and successful, diversification isn't the way to do that. Maintaining those two concepts and working with them is important. I think saying free lunch is more of a simplification.
How do you think that someone could calculate a person's human capital and consider this when building an investment portfolio?
That's a good question, and it's a complicated one because it's not easy to value your human capital. What are you going to earn 5, 10, 20 years from now? You don't know what you're going to be doing in that time period. It's a difficult exercise, but it's no more difficult than valuing a company or valuing a piece of real estate. What's Facebook or Meta worth? Well, a few weeks ago it was worth one number and then it loses $200 billion in one day. So valuation is a difficult exercise in the corporate market. It's also difficult in the financial market, but you can get an estimate. And you estimate that by looking at what you anticipate someone to make over the course of their life. On average, what do people earn at various ages? and discounting it, net present value, very important technique, and you come up with a number. And for some people, that number is in the millions. For other people, it's going to be a lower number. But the key isn't the value of human capital. I don't care about the number as much as I care about its risk characteristics. What is it correlated with? Is that number real estate? Is that number banking? Is that number engineering? Or is that number just a professor? The characteristics of that number are much more important than the number itself. But I agree with you, it's a difficult calculation.
What do you think is the right way to diversify? I mean, should small investors only invest in stocks or bonds, for example, or should they even build more sophisticated portfolios with local and foreign equities, real estate and real estate investment trusts, private equity and venture capital, or natural resources like lumber? Or should they still invest in more speculative instruments such as interest rate futures, currencies, commodities, swaps, and options? I mean, is there a formula for all of that?
So, that's a great question again, and the short answer is there's no formula. There never will be a formula. I think first and foremost, it's very important to differentiate between investors in countries that are very well developed with a diversified capital market where they can invest in anything, and investors in countries where they don't have access to all of that. That's going to make a difference. I think it's also important to account for human capital, what you do for a living. But I think the most important thing for investors is to make it interesting, to keep engaged with your investments. And sometimes, in order to make things interesting, we have to invest in things that may be riskier. People ask me about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. I say, I'm not sure if it's a good investment, but it's interesting. It'll keep you engaged in markets. And I think sometimes what we have to do is invest in things to keep interested. The diversified global portfolio is a very efficient portfolio, but it's a very boring portfolio. It's not very exciting. It's not very engaging. And we don't want people to be bored in finance. We want them to be engaged. To do that, sometimes you have to invest in some of the things that you mentioned. But the short answer to your question is there is no formula and there will never be a formula. There's science of finance and there's the art of finance.
Let me just go back to something really interesting that you said about if you take the majority of billionaires, they all made very concentrated bets. They built a company and basically all of their money was invested in that company. But I really would like to know your thoughts about investors that also became billionaires and had extremely diversified portfolios, such as Warren Buffett and Ray Dalio. I mean, do you think their strategies also apply to the concepts that you're bringing to us?
I think those are two great examples, especially Warren Buffett. I think that those are the exceptions, not the rules. If you take a look at the billionaires or even people with hundreds of millions of dollars and you ask them, how did you become so wealthy and successful? I don't think many of them will answer, I diversified my way to this success. Now, once they became successful with a very concentrated bet, then I would suggest that they diversify. I think someone like Elon Musk should sell some of his Tesla stock and invest it in more diversified assets to preserve wealth. But in terms of people that got to extraordinary levels of wealth, they didn't do that with a very diversified portfolio. And I think that's the paradox at the heart of personal wealth management. It's a paradox, and we have to live with that in everything that we recommend. Ray Dalio and certainly Warren Buffett were more of the exception than they are the rule. Once they become very successful, important to diversify. Prior to that enormous amount of success, diversification didn't do it.
So for our research, the classic American portfolio is basically 60% in stocks and apparently 40% in fixed income. Apparently, there also are those formulas that segregate investments in preservation and risk and income that are offered to the investors by major institutions. I would like to know your thoughts about this specific formula since it's not actually a a diversifying strategy, but basically just a separation of sectors. I mean, 40% fixed income, 60% stocks, and preservation, risk, and income. I mean, do you like this formula? Is that appeal to you as an investor?
The answer to your question very much depends on who is asking me. There are three types of institutions that can be asking me that question: individuals, corporations, and then governments, sovereign wealth funds. I think historically, the 60-40 portfolio, 60 stocks, 40 bonds, historically, that was designed for institutional investors, perhaps pension funds, endowments, sovereign wealth funds, where it was just broadly diversified and we said 60 stocks and 40 bonds. But I think that for the individual, especially in the 21st century, given all the uncertainty that's taking place, it might be too blunt an instrument to be used in the portfolio. And I think that we have to dig down a little bit deeper and certainly take a look at human capital and the drivers of human capital. So the short answer is, I don't think 60-40 is the right way for most individual investors.
So basically, that would be sort of a way to apply the same methodology to the masses, right? Because it's easier to explain to them that it's something to be used. 60-40, it's simple, it's memorable, then do an in-depth analysis of the character of the investor that we're actually talking about, right?
You're absolutely right. And you have to understand that finance is a process of education as well. So, for example, if I am in an elevator, I'm in an elevator going down a building and someone asks me, Professor, I know nothing about money and finance. What should I do with my retirement money? I know nothing. And in an elevator, I have 10 seconds to answer. My response would be 60-40, bye-bye. In an elevator, 10 seconds. But if it's a very, very tall building, then I would ask them, what do you do for a living? Where is your human capital? And if this is over a long dinner where we have hours, then we would dig into risk tolerance, goals, when they want to retire, where interest rates are, where they live. It's a process of education. Initially, there's nothing wrong with starting with 60-40 for people that know nothing. They don't even know the difference between a stock and a bond. Many people don't know those differences. If you don't know the difference, you should know the difference, and we start with 60-40. But as you get more sophisticated, as you think more about investing and how to build a portfolio that's tailored for you, that vitamin, 60-40, isn't very good for the masses.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about my country, Brazil. Brazil is historically known as a place where fixed income outperforms equities in most periods in history. And considering this factor in our market, I would like to know, what do you think Brazilian investors should invest less in stocks than American? You think they should do that because of this volatility in the market, to invest less in stocks than Americans?
Yeah, that's a complex question, and we certainly need a very long elevator to answer that. But I must say that there are two very important things that a lot of investors forget when they're looking at performance. And I think the first is that inflation is always something that has to be subtracted from the performance. When somebody says to me, I scored 6 goals in the game, my question is, but what did your opponent score? 6 goals doesn't tell me how much, whether you won the game or not. What did the opponent score? And then we know if you won the game. And I think the same thing is very true with performance in financial markets, fixed income or stocks. Yes, bonds did very well nominally. What did the opponent do? What was inflation? I think that's number one. Think after inflation. Number two, when you're in a concentrated economy where they're commodity-based, perhaps export-based, manufacturing-based, and you don't have a diversified economy, it's much more important to invest outside the country. So my suggestion to Brazilians would be the same as my suggestion to Canadians. We also have a very concentrated economy. I say invest outside the country because you don't have exposure to companies that are global and are doing global things. When I'm talking to American, US audiences where the S&P 500, the big index, has concentration across all sectors, they're not isolated sectors, my message of international exposure isn't going to be as important, and it's certainly not going to be as effective because of the fact that you already have those industries. So the answer to your question is, for people in Brazil, it's more important to have that international exposure, I think, than it is for people in North American markets that have more concentrated or portfolios that are more diversified. But the performance of stocks versus bonds, historically, we know that equity outperforms globally. Locally, that can be different.
There's another issue in Brazil that I would think that occurs all around the globe when we speak about financial markets. It's the behavior gap. This is a huge thing in Brazil. Investors withdraw money from the stock market when stocks fall, and they invest when stocks get to close historical heights. How do you think that investors, people that are listening to this, what they would do to avoid this kind of behavior?
Look, that's not just a Brazilian problem. It's a Canadian problem. It's a British problem. It's a European problem. Individual investors everywhere tend to trade too much. They take action, and that action harms them more often than not. This happens in periods of volatility. I get questions from students, from colleagues, from friends. Moshe, the market's down 10%. What should I do? Nothing. But they can't do nothing. They feel like they have to react. Something's happening. So they react, and it's wrong. I think the key message is stop reacting so much. Don't react as frequently, number one. Number two, you have to remember what your goals were. When you set up that portfolio, what was the goal? 10, 20 years from now, why are you changing your goals a month later? If you change your portfolio, did your goals change? Your goals haven't changed. So why are you changing your portfolio? So I think just reacting is the problem, and to react less. And I think that only comes with age and in some sense maturity and experience. To say, well, I've seen this before. I mean, I remember in 1987, the stock market crashed. I was in my early 20s. I was a college student, but I was also trading options on the Chicago Board Options Exchange, puts and calls and straddles. And it was just astonishing to see the markets declining, and almost everything I did that day and in the few months afterwards, everything I did was 100% wrong. I reacted in the wrong times. I thought it would stay down. I would buy. Completely wrong. Had I slept through that month, just go to sleep, wake up in a month, I'd be much wealthier now. Don't react, I think, is the important lesson.
So that lesson basically is smacked down to traders or people that are appealed to that message of getting rich overnight. And this is also a huge thing in Brazil. Like, people maybe don't get the sense that investments should require patience, and they would not need to accumulate their money, their fortune over time, because if they do those simple trades, or if they reallocate portfolio real quick and get the timing of the market, they will get rich real fast. Do you have any criticism about people who tend to do that? I mean, the graphic analysis of the market, to do market timing and, maybe anticipate the getting rich aspect of those needs that most of us want to in life?
Look, I have good things to say about them and bad things to say about them. Let me start with the good things. It's good to be engaged with the financial markets. You learn a lot about the financial environment by trading. You learn about what impacts value. The Federal Reserve or the Bank of Brazil raised interest rates. Why did the market? You learn a lot. I have a huge respect for the pedagogical value of trading. you learn from it, as long as it doesn't overwhelm you and you don't put too much time and money into it. I like people who do that. That's the good. The bad, it's not going to help. You're not going to make very much more on average than someone that just bought and hold. That's what the data says. Yes, there are billionaires, but for every billionaire, there's probably a billion people who lost money. On average, I don't think it works. That's the bad. The good, great education. Keep it going.
That would be the answer for almost all the problems, right? Education. So, do you like the thesis of this two Yale professors called life cycle investing? And the theory argues that young people should expose up to 200% of their equity to the stock market through leveraged operations, while they're mostly under 30 in order for them to maximize their results. I would like to know your thoughts on that.
So that idea has been around for quite a while. Sometimes it's called life cycle investing. If you talk to people that have been trading for many years, brokers, they'll call it leveraged investing. When you're young, you leverage, and when you get older, you reduce the leverage. Part of the justification for it, so let me be clear, I think it's a good idea. Part of the justification for it is that when you're young, you have human capital, so you can borrow against your human capital. You're not as leveraged as you think. And let me give you an example of that. If your human capital is worth 2 million, just for example, 2 million in human capital, and you have a portfolio of 100,000, if you borrow another 100,000, your portfolio that is $200,000, your leverage 200%, isn't really leveraged because you have 2 million in human capital. You're not really leveraged. You're just taking some of your human capital and you're securitizing it, or you're borrowing against it. So that seems to be prudent if your human capital is reliable. As you get older, though, your human capital shrinks, you have less of it left. That strategy wouldn't make as much sense. But to sum up, I am a fan of borrowing money early on in the life cycle. I did this myself in my 20s and 30s, decades before that book was written. The theory has been out there for a while. I think it's okay if your human capital is safe.
I see. When we look back into, for example, the 1929 crash market, a lot of people were taking money from the banks and putting it in the stock market, because their belief was that they could get returns that were above what they would have to pay from interest for the banks. So if we take that in consideration and mix it with what you just said, so it's not a problem for people to have this ideology if they're doing it prudently, if they have human capital, if they're young and still could manage their risks, just because of the time and knowledge they will acquire over time, right?
So, you mentioned a number of interesting points. I think, first of all, I'm not sure 1929, that's almost 100 years ago, is a good lesson for today. It's sometimes dangerous to take history and say, this is going to happen today as well. I mean, can we go back to the Roman periods and say, well, the Romans did this? In 1929, to be specific, the financial market wasn't what we had today. We didn't have the central banks we didn't have today. We didn't have a lot of the regulation in place. I mean, I hate to say it, in 1929, much of the stock market was a scam. It's like getting spam emails. We didn't have the SEC in the US, the Securities and Exchange Commission. So you can't just say, well, in 1929 this was dangerous, so today it's dangerous. I'm skeptical of using historical precedents for today. History is amusing, history is entertaining, history is thought-provoking, but it's dangerous to say, this happened then, so it'll happen today. That's number one. But I think more importantly, as I said before, you can borrow if you have the ability to pay the interest and the principal back because you have the human capital to do it, or you have housing capital with sufficient equity. It is not a good idea at all if you do what people did in 1929, which is just to borrow and simply speculate with no security behind it. So I'm a fan. I think it's a good idea, not in excess, provided, once again, I don't want to be misinterpreted, you have the other assets to back you up.
So the S&P SPIVA survey has a very similar results in the US and Brazil. Around 85% of active funds underperform their benchmark periods and 10-year periods in both countries. And that, do you think that, based on what you just said, that investors should, in the general public basically, they should do stock picking for everything that they have in their portfolio, like specifically methodically pick every single one of their equities?
If you take a look at a financial statement, corporate financial statements that are released by companies, they are hundreds of pages that are released every quarter. And the lawyers are making them into thousands of pages. Who has time to read all of that? Who has time to read? I barely can keep up with TikTok. How am I supposed to read thousands of pages? I can't do stock picking. I don't have time to analyze it. And it's very dangerous to do stock picking without reading everything. So for me personally, I don't have the time. I don't have the inclination. I'm not a big stock picker. But if your job is to specialize in the petroleum industry, or your job is you're a specialist in the commodities industry, and what you do all day is you read financial statements, well, you have a competitive advantage. You might want to spend a little bit more time reading a particular company. Maybe you want to do stock picking. But as you pointed out earlier, the data is very depressing. The data is very discouraging. Most stock pickers fail, and that's very depressing. So this is why I don't try to do too much of that.
Definitely is. Since when you're just beginning to learn about investing, you want to be independent and to be certain about your analysis. But absolutely, if you don't have the experience or all the knowledge that the market can provide at any given time, probably you would go behind the market if you try to do this active managing of your portfolio. And for that, I would like to connect it with the following question. Do you think there's any kind of a perfect portfolio that could work in any season or any market? And the reason why I'm asking you that is that because Bridgewater has this all-weather fund that basically they would go you would go secure and still have returns over the market if you invested in it. I mean, that's the promise. So I would like to know your thoughts on that.
Look, I'm not familiar with the specifics of that particular fund. As you know, there are 10,000 funds available. In fact, here's the paradox. There are more funds than stocks. I mean, that's gotten a bit crazy. There are really only about, 3,000 stocks in the investable universe in the US that are reasonable, and there are 10,000 funds that you can buy. So, I mean, in some sense, every fund has its own strategy. So I'm not a big believer that there is a one solution for everyone, and certainly not when it comes to people as they age and they get older. And I'm going to say this again, this might even be boring already. It's an educational process. It's an education. Let me give you an example. My 14-year-old daughter is now getting interested in investing. It's interesting. It goes up, it goes down. And she tells me, Daddy, what do you think about this company? And what do you think about that stock? And should I buy this and sell that? Do you really think that I should tell my 14-year-old daughter the facts of life? Honey, the market is efficient. Just get the S&P 500 and go back to doing something else. You'll never beat the market. Should I tell her that at 14? Obviously not. I want to encourage her to get engaged with personal finance. And if this is what excites her, sure, go trade and enjoy and buy Tesla and sell Facebook and you're learning something. Don't spend too much money on it. As she gets older, we teach her, you didn't do very well, did you? You lost. Well, there's something called efficient markets. And that's a process. But if I tell my 14-year-old, don't waste your time, stock pickers never win, she's going to completely get turned off of finance. I don't want that. This is the cost that I'm willing to pay. And I think the same thing is true in your 20s and in your 30s. It might be futile, but it's good education.
Well, but that's also a great lesson. So what you're saying that you should encourage people to be excited and to want to learn about and make those mistakes in order for them to be in love with the financial market and not have this hate relationship with it, right? If you just told, for example, as you said, your 14-year-old daughter, you can do nothing, you can't beat the market, just invest in S&P, because that's not exciting at all.
When you think about what personal finance is, financial literacy is about budgeting, mortgages, taxes, insurance, investing. Which is the most exciting one that's likely to get the youth passionate about personal finance? Insurance? Really? Hey, today we're going to talk about car insurance. Right? Taxes? I can't think of anything more boring. Like mortgage rates. What makes people excited about money? Investing. Let's go with that. Even if we know that a lot of that activity is futile. It gets them interested, engaged, and they become better financial consumers, which will help them for the rest of their life. And I think that's the key. Use it, don't abuse it.
That's a great lesson. You're very thoughtful, open person, and I'm really, really grateful for having the opportunity to spend this time with you, Professor. And I would like to thank you for agreeing to having this conversation, and I wish you all the best.
You too, and thank you very much. I appreciated the questions and the way you presented them, and I'll say this again, your English was perfect. Don't be worried.
Thank you. Yeah. Bom, meus amigos, foi um prazer enorme poder ter a conversa com esse professor incrível e, particularmente para mim, é um privilégio poder passar por esse tempo, porque a gente aprende demais com pessoas tão brilhantes que tiveram uma carreira incrível, acumulando conhecimento, tendo a oportunidade de falar com tantas pessoas, para, nessa breve hora que a gente teve de entrevista, conseguir resumir tudo isso aqui num conhecimento consolidado para que você possa consumir e aplicar na sua própria vida. Então, de novo, você pode me encontrar no canal Jovens de Negócios, no @BrenoPerrucci no Instagram, e eu fico por aqui. Foi um prazer enorme poder passar esse tempo com vocês.
Que aula incrível do Mosh Milevski, né? Esse é o nível de aula que vocês terão no nosso MBA em Investimentos e Asset Allocation. Vai ter muita gente relevante no mercado financeiro como professor. E é com eles que você vai aprender tudo o que você precisa para virar um ótimo assessor de investimentos e construir uma carreira muito bem sucedida em bancos, corretoras, escritórios ou fintechs. Mas enquanto a gente não abre as inscrições para o MBA, continua aqui com a gente porque a nossa próxima aula vai ser com o Guilherme Benchimol. E olha só quantos assuntos legais o sócio fundador da XP vai abordar. O potencial de crescimento das empresas no mercado financeiro, quantos gerentes de bancos, corretoras e escritórios devem contratar nos próximos anos, as grandes oportunidades de carreira e empreendedorismo no mercado financeiro, os padrões de comportamento de quem se dá bem nesse setor de investimentos. E você vai ouvir tudo isso da boca do controlador da maior empresa de investimentos do Brasil. Então não desperdice essa oportunidade. E antes de eu me despedir, eu gostaria de lembrar a você o seguinte: quem entrar no meu grupo de WhatsApp vai receber o resumo dessa aula em PDF. E é preciso colocar no campo de comentários abaixo a hashtag Asset Allocation com uma mensagem explicando como essa técnica ajuda os investidores a ganhar mais dinheiro. Depois, faça a prova que está no link também aqui embaixo, demora só uns 5 minutinhos, e quem fizer a prova e deixar o melhor comentário pode ganhar uma bolsa para cursar o MBA em Investimentos e Asset Allocation, que eu vou lançar semana que vem. Quem tirar 6 ou mais na prova ganha um desconto de 20% para cursar o MBA. E todos que fizerem a prova ganham também um certificado de participação na aula magna dessa semana. Então clique no botão e faça a prova agora mesmo. Vejo você na próxima aula com o Guilherme Benchimol.